I'm feeling much better now.
I'm glad, honey. Time for your food.
Can I go outside if I eat this?
We'll see. You know how you get sick in the afternoon. Don't say it tastes funny. You know I don't like to hear that.
The Sixth Sense.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
This episode that we're taking on today is a very interesting psychological syndrome that I was first introduced to, I think as well as Lee, in watching The Sixth Sense, and that is Munchausen Syndrome.
Now, there are two different types of Munchausen Syndrome. There's the one where the person makes themselves the victim, and then what is called Munchausen by proxy, in which they are making someone else the victim and getting the attention from it. So we'll get more into what that means and those differences. But for the most part, the Munchausen by proxy is what you see in stories.
So the psychological definition from nhs.uk is Munchausen syndrome is a psychological disorder where someone pretends to be ill or deliberately produces symptoms of illness in themselves. Their main intention is to assume the sick role so that people care for them and they are a center of attention. I'm fascinated by this concept because a lot of the times it doesn't stop at just pretending to be sick. They will take it a step further and, like the definition said, deliberately produce symptoms, whether that is making themselves sick by ingesting poison or by proxy making someone else sick by giving them poison, or finding some other way to imitate or mimic the physical health disorders that they're trying to get sympathy for.
When I was researching this, one of the ways that the blog poster was talking about seeing this fairly regularly in hospitals, I believe it was a nurse that was posting, said that they would open wounds on their body and then rub feces into it and create that infection and continue to stay in the hospital because of it.
Gross.
That should give you an idea of how desperately these types of people want to maintain this illness, whatever this illness is. The idea is to be the victim and therefore get the attention from being the victim. So a lot milder versions of what we're talking about today in your writing could be someone always wanting to be seen as the victim in order to get the attention from the other characters.
Munchausen syndrome was named after Baron von Munchausen, who was an 18th century German officer known for embellishing the stories of his life and experiences. I don't know a whole lot about him specifically, but it's interesting that this one person was so well known for just exaggerating everything that he'd done that he got a whole syndrome named after himself for it.
Kind of impressive, actually. So there are a couple of facets of Munchausen's. There is the Munchausen's of the self-affliction that we talked about in the definition. There is the Munchausen's by proxy. Often this is a caretaker or a maternal figure who is perpetrating this on someone under their care. And then one of the more recent developments in this is Munchausen's by internet.
This is a little bit of a dangerous line because I'm perpetually distrustful of everyone. So you have things like GoFundMe and other crowdfunding websites that help people raise money for causes. And a lot of ones on there can't be verified as the person's actually sick. So it is a little bit of that Munchausen by internet of not only are they gaining that emotional support by having people think of them as ill, but they're gaining financial support from it now too.
Like I mentioned earlier, most of what we see in storytelling is the Munchausen's by proxy because there's a lot more of that interesting dynamic between having that in two different people instead of one person just throwing their hands in the air and saying, "I'm the victim, love me." That's less interesting to read and write.
It also gives you an interesting opportunity to explore the two sides of it, because the person who is perpetrating the Munchausen by proxy isn't really trying to gain attention for their child or their care person or whoever it is that they're doing it to. it's still a selfish thing. And I think it's a little bit more self-centered than actual Munchausen because they're not inflicting any of the pain, any of the sickness on themselves. Someone else suffers so that they can get attention and sympathy. And that tends to be why it's a lot of your caretakers, your mothers that do it, because there's a lot of sympathy that goes to the family of someone who is suffering from a chronic illness.
Our opener was from The Sixth Sense. That is a common example, and I feel like a lot of people can relate to because they have seen the movie. They understand that dynamic there. There's also Stephen King's It, where Eddie was a victim of his mom in the Proxy scenario.
One of the other examples that I'm personally familiar with is in Supernatural. Sam and Dean end up investigating the spirit of a girl who is close to death. She's actually in a coma since her mother made her drink bleach.
One that I thought was interesting, I haven't seen it yet, I meant to before we recorded, was The Act, in which the main character, I believe, is on trial because she murdered her mom, who was perpetrating the Munchausen by proxy on her.
And then in The Secret Garden, you have a very interesting example because Colin's father is so set on avoiding attention that he has his servants, and he even hired a doctor to convince his son that he's too frail, too crippled to even leave the house. So he never really even learned to walk because he was told his whole life that he can't.
So the father is keeping him isolated, so it's kind of a reverse Munchausen, where he's still abusing by controlling with physical disabilities, but the attention seeking is sort of inverted there.
Now, we want to clear a couple things up. Munchausen's is a psychological syndrome that needs to be diagnosed. This is not hypochondria. It is not a thinking that they're sick sincerely. People with Munchausen know they're not, but they make themselves anyway.
And it's not necessarily a psychosomatic illness where you think yourself into becoming ill. It's an intentional making yourself physically ill.
And then when it is by proxy, it doesn't have to just be poisoning. The end game is that discomfort, the death. So it can be done in many ways, like in The Secret Garden, where it's basically just convincing the kid that he can't walk and that he's crippled. He didn't ever actually get poisoned or injured in any way. So it can be more of a psychological game played against the victim to make them think that they are ill or have a chronic illness of some kind.
So when you're writing this into your story, one of the key things to keep in mind is a lot of time spent in the hospital. If Munchausen's is happening in secret, it's not necessarily Munchausen's. It can be a variation of. But that hospital time is what really gives people attention. And so there's almost always repeated visits to the hospital by whoever's suffering the illness.
Other things that you want to keep in mind in that aspect is that the symptoms will improve while they're at the hospital, especially if it's by proxy and the person's being poisoned. They can't really get poisoned very easily at a hospital. So they're being treated, they'll get better. As soon as they go home, everything will get worse again.
Another thing to keep in mind is the perpetrator often has goals, but those goals don't tend to be as physical. They don't necessarily show as give me money, give me food. They tend to be more get me out of work, give me sympathy. So non-physical gains from perpetrating Munchausen's.
And then, like we mentioned earlier, for somebody who is not doing by proxy, the self-injuring is very common because they want to be able to go to the doctor, show that they have physical symptoms, that they have actual problems that can be seen, that can be verified, because otherwise they're going to be told by the doctor, there's nothing wrong with you, go home.
Look, my arm is red, it's swelling, there's clearly an infection here. Give me attention and give me support and give me care.
I think one of the reasons why they tend to lean away from imitating some sort of mental illness is because they aren't visible. The visible things, the things that can be seen by others, are what draw the attention. There are lots of people diagnosed as mental illnesses, ADHD, bipolar, that are just normal everyday people living their lives that don't have any outward symptoms. So it's a lot harder to gain that attention if what you're trying to imitate isn't physical in some way.
They will, however, exaggerate a lot of these everyday woes. I don't have a headache, I have a migraine. I don't have just joint pain, I have arthritis. I don't have simple dizziness, I have vertigo. These things that make whatever these everyday common things that people have sound far more dramatic than they necessarily need to.
And random fun fact to finish it off here. The most common kinds of people to have Munchausen's are going to be women working in healthcare, or again, the caregivers of some kind.
So when you're writing this, I feel like it needs to be a major plot point. If you want to have a side character that expresses some of these things, then they would be more in the victim mentality of woe is me all of the time, or if anyone else is getting attention, they're trying to pull it away. But if you want to integrate actual Munchausen's into your story, it's very difficult to do on a small scale. Unless it's something like The Sixth Sense, where it's a glancing encounter with it, and it's a major part of their lives, but not necessarily a major part of your main character's lives.
It's definitely an interesting topic to explore. You do need to do extra research if this is something that you want to write about in order to do it correctly. This is kind of a brief overview from not psychologists. But if you do choose to take this, go out, have fun with it, and
write selfishly.